Jan. How you been?
Good, how are you?
Hey, Corey. Good seeing you.
Good seeing you too. Okay, thanks very much for being here. Let me thank Senators Booker and Blumenthal, who I expect will be up in a moment, for being here this morning. And let me thank our friends in the House, Elijah Cummings, Ro Khanna, Jan Schakowsky, Peter Welch, Ilhan Omar, and Joe Neguse for helping lead the effort on this enormously important issue. Today we are discussing an outrage that is impacting the health and well-being of tens of millions of Americans. And that is that the people of our country pay by far, not even close, the highest prices in the world for the prescription drugs they need. That has got to end, and the legislation that we are supporting will do just that. It is totally absurd that 1 out of 5 patients in this country who get a prescription from their doctors are unable to fill that prescription because they cannot afford the price of the medicine. Think about it. People walk into a doctor's office because they are sick. Doctor diagnoses the illness, writes out a prescription, but that individual cannot get the medicine that he or she needs. And what happens? What happens is that that person will become sicker, maybe ending up in the hospital at great cost to the system. And let's be clear, sometimes that individual may die. Now, why do our people pay far more for prescription drugs than people in other countries? Why are there no restrictions on what a drug company can charge? And why is it that tomorrow the medicine that you use may be doubled or tripled in price? And the answer is simple. With a possible exception, in my view, of Wall Street, the pharmaceutical industry is the most powerful political force in this country. They have spent more than $4 billion in lobbying and campaign contributions over the past 20 years, and they have hired some 1,400 lobbyists, often former leaders of our two major parties, to fight for their profits. In other words, they own Washington. While Americans cannot afford the prescription drugs they desperately need, the pharmaceutical industry year after year makes huge profits and pays an outrageous level of compensation to their CEOs. Last year, 5 largest drug companies in America made nearly $60 billion in profit, while the top 5 pharmaceutical industry CEOs made over $113 million in total compensation in 2017. And I can give you many, many examples, just one. The former CEO of Gilead, John Martin, became a billionaire by charging people with hepatitis C $1,000 for a pill that cost $1 to manufacture. Now, I suspect that every member up here and every member of Congress, every day, hears stories from their constituents about the high cost of prescription drugs. Let me just read one, just one. Nicole Smith Holt from Minnesota writes, quote, "My son Alec died from diabetic ketoacidosis from rationing his insulin. He gave his life because he couldn't afford his insulin. I assumed that Alec's situation was an isolated one. I didn't realize how corrupt the system was." 50 miles from my home in Burlington, Vermont, many of the same medications manufactured by the same companies in the same factories are available for a fraction of the price that Americans pay. Just a few examples. Januvia, the diabetes drug, costs over $1,300 in the United States, but just $376 in Canada. The EpiPen costs $637 in the United States, $250 in Canada. All over this country, people are asking a simple question: How many Americans have to get sick? How many Americans have to die before Congress is prepared to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry? The American people are demanding that Congress listen to their concerns and not the power of the pharmaceutical industry. And today, we do that. We do that with three major pieces of legislation that would substantially reduce prescription drug prices in this country and also save the federal government significant sums of money. And I'm not going to go into it at length because the members of Congress here will discuss them at greater length. But one of them is the Prescription Drug Price Relief Act, which says that in America we should not be paying more than the people in other countries. The Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Act says that we have to use the clout of Medicare to negotiate fair prices with the pharmaceutical industry. The Affordable and Safe Prescription Drug Importation Act says that with so many advocates of unfettered free trade, yes, pharmacists and distributors should be able to bring lower cost prescription drugs into this country. Let me conclude by saying this. As many of you know, President Trump over and over again has talked about the high cost of prescription drugs. During his campaign, he said that he was going to stop the pharmaceutical companies from, quote, getting away with murder, end quote. Well, today, I say to President Trump, if you are serious about lowering prescription drug costs in this country, support our legislation and get your Republican colleagues on board. Thank you. Let me now introduce a guy who has been working on this issue for years, doing a fantastic job in the House, Cummings.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Senator Sanders, and I am honored to be here with my distinguished colleagues, all of whom have worked very, very hard and have been at the leadership with regard to this very important issue. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today along with many advocates who are pushing hard for lowering the price of prescription drugs in our country. I've been investigating the skyrocketing prices of drugs since 2011 for both generic and brand name drugs. I've held hearings, written letters, and pleaded with my Republican colleagues to address this very important issue. I, along with Representative Welch, even met with the President about a year and a half ago. We went to the White House early in the President's first year. We gave him the same bill that we are introducing today, the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Act. We asked for his endorsement. We simply asked for his support. We simply asked him to do what he had already promised America he would do. He initially said that he would support the legislation. As a matter of fact, he told then Secretary Price to make it happen. But since then, ladies and gentlemen, we have had radio silence. America cannot afford radio silence when it comes to this issue. And unfortunately, there hasn't been any progress since then. And it's clear the problem is simply getting worse. It is interesting as I listen to Senator Sanders talk about the effects that this can have, of these skyrocketing prices can have. I cannot help but think about when I was in the hospital for 6 months. And after about about a month in there, a lady came to me who I had met in the hospital, and she said, I'm getting out today. I said, oh, that's wonderful. And I said, Miss Mary, give me your information. I'm going to write you a note, keep up with you. And then she started crying. And I said, why are you crying? She said, when I came here to Hopkins, they had to give me the treatment. I got the operation. She said, I'm crying because I cannot afford the cure. Can't afford the cure. And so a poll found that 1 in 5 Americans reported not filling a prescription due to the high cost, just like that lady at Johns Hopkins. Another study found that most widely used brand name drugs have more than doubled in price since 2006. America, I say that we are better than that. So today I'm here to reintroduce the Medicare Drug Price Negotiation Act, co-led by my friends Representative Welch and Doggett, to allow Medicare to negotiate prices directly with drug companies. I'm also reintroducing the Affordable and Safe Prescription Drug Importation Act to allow Americans to buy safe, affordable prescription drugs from other countries. These bills are important because it's time to provide much-needed relief to the American people. Ladies and gentlemen, and I say to the President, no more talk, no more tweet, no more commotion, emotion, and motion and no results. The American people want action. They should not have to decide between paying their bills or paying for prescription drugs. And I say again, we're better than that. We need real and immediate action to lower drug prices in this country. And finally, the American people deserve that. And I too say to the President, you claim that you want to help Americans, and as I told you, Mr. President, in your office, Americans do not want government to hurt them. Americans want government to help them. And this is something that you can do to help all Americans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Booker. Good job.
I'm honored to stand here today with colleagues of mine from the House and the Senate to address what is really a stain on the very idea of America. It's a shame point for our country. We live in a nation that professes to believe in ideals like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and millions of Americans' health and well-being is being put at risk by the outrageous and unjustifiably high cost of prescription drugs. We live in a nation where families are hurting, individuals are going without treatment, where people's lives are being put at risk because we are not doing the common sense things necessary to drive down the cost of drugs. Well, today we have three solid, common sense, pragmatic bills that can drive down the cost of drugs and end the shame in our nation that 1 in 5 Americans cannot afford their prescription drugs. The stories I hear coming from New Jersey, whether it is mental health care drugs or people struggling with chronic illnesses and diseases like diabetes, who are priced out, who are cutting pills in half, who are putting aside medication, who are undermining their lives, their livelihoods, their well-beings, and putting themselves at risk. It's unacceptable, and it's got to stop. We've heard talk and lip service from the White House to Congress about solving this problem, but no action. These bills can. And what's even more outrageous about the lack of action is these bills have been scored. The bill Senator Sanders and I wrote to allow safe importations from other countries. That bill alone was scored to save the American taxpayer over $6 billion over 10 years. So think about this right now. We not only are allowing the ongoing pain and hurt to happen to American families, we are not only an outlier in developed nations in what we are doing to our own people with the cost of prescription drugs, but we're also wasting taxpayer dollars by not using our collective power in Medicaid and Medicare negotiation, by not using our common sense by allowing importations. This has to stop. I want to say finally and put a challenge out there. These bills are common sense. These bills lower the cost to taxpayers. These bills make good business sense. These bills are about basic fairness and justice. I challenge the President of the United States, who's given lip service to this, a lot of talk, but it's time for action. It is time for action. It is time we live up to our ideals as a country. In the United States of America, the amount of money you make should not determine the kind of health care that you get. It is time to lower prescription drugs and give access to all Americans to quality health care. Thank you.
Congressman Ro Khanna.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Sanders, for your moral and courageous leadership on this issue. I'm honored to be here with colleagues. Representing Silicon Valley, I thought I'd take my 2 minutes to address the myth that these pharmaceutical companies need to fleece the American people in order to support medical innovation or new technology. That's the argument they make. Let's deal with facts. 63% of new drugs are invented or manufactured by startups, not by the big pharmaceuticals. Now, let me tell you, in Silicon Valley, no one asks when you come with a business plan, how long is your exclusive patent going to be? They don't ask that. We fund companies that have losses. What they ask is, how many people are going to use it? Are you telling me if someone invents a new cure for diabetes or Alzheimer's or cancer that they're not going to get funding? Second point, in the last 10 years, Pfizer, $139 billion went to stock buybacks. $139 billion. About $80 billion went to research and development. So let's just be very clear. They're charging Americans not to put money into research and development, which has been flat. They're charging Americans to pay their executives and their shareholders in stock buybacks. I mean, if they were putting all the money in research and development, at least they'd have an argument. Final point. From 2010 to 2016, every drug, all 210 drugs that have been approved by the FDA have had public funding. Every single one of them have been funded by the tax dollars. And then what happens? I mean, Senator Sanders is right to compare pharmaceuticals to Wall Street. Do you think the people running these pharmaceuticals are Nobel laureates or research professors? No. They're Harvard MBAs who could care less whether they were running Goldman Sachs or Pfizer. And what they are doing is taking public research, public investment, and privatizing the profit. And that's why we need reform that's going to help the American people and is in no way going to hurt innovation or new drugs being developed.
Thank you. Senator Blumenthal.
Well, let me first come to the defense of the Harvard Business School. Second, let me just say, I can't remember a time when I've disagreed with my great friend, Representative Cummings, but I would like to see a little more commotion and emotion from some of our Republican colleagues. I agree with him. We need more motion with results. And I think we ought to talk about the elephant in the room, which is Big Pharma. The reason why we've seen radio silence from the White House on this issue is that a funny thing happened on the way to the White House for President Trump. He began listening to the pharmaceutical drug industry. And he began buying those myths and misleading pitches that have so confused everybody. It's affecting businesses. It's affecting our defense industry. It is impacting our national security. And so these three measures are more than common sense. They are a mandate for our nation's health security. The president's right now down at the border looking at this manufactured crisis. The real crisis is in our hospitals and our doctors' offices and the homes of Americans who have to choose between putting food on the table and buying drugs that are necessary for their survival. Americans should not be charged more than people in other countries. We deserve the same bargains that Europe and Canada have. Importing those drugs makes sense, and reducing the costs of those drugs after studies of what those costs are makes sense. And giving Medicare the ability to negotiate what could be more basic and sensible. The time has come for these measures. When I was Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, I sued drug companies because of their manipulating generic and brand name drugs. But the laws now on the books are inadequate. And we have an obligation, the American people, to come together as we're doing right here, and hopefully our Republican colleagues will join us because we have a common stake in making pharmaceutical drugs affordable for Americans. Thank you.
Congresswoman Schakowsky.
So millions and millions of Americans this very day are making terrible choices. And people are not just getting sicker, but they are sometimes dying. I just wonder, with this shutdown, how many people that have been laid off or are working without pay right now are making those kinds of choices. This is an outcome, in part, I think, and a consequence for many people as part of the shutdown. You've heard that nearly 25% of Americans reported that they skipped a dose or ended up cutting a pill in half. And that includes Shane Patrick Boyle, who died in 2017 when he came up just $50 short of his month's supply of insulin. He was no longer on his parents' policy, and he was trying to make it on his own. And this tragedy should never have happened to him or to anyone. Americans are demanding concrete actions. According to a recent poll, 73% of Americans believe that prescription drug prices are too high. And why are the pharmaceutical companies doing that? Why is pharma doing it? Because it can. 10 of the most TV advertised drugs every month cost between $500 and $8,369. That's a per month figure for the top drugs you all see on television being advertised. And that's why these bills that are being introduced today are so critical. They finally put an end to the pharmaceutical industry's unchecked power to set soaring prices. Prescription drug negotiation in Medicare, safe drug importation, capping the price of drugs sold in the United States are bedrock to providing relief to the millions of Americans who rely on these often life-saving drugs. Additionally, we can't allow trade deals like the renegotiated NAFTA to lock in the United States into high prescription drug prices and prevent Congress from enacting meaningful legislation. So we're just simply not going to cave into the pharmaceutical industry and their 1,400 lobbyists. That's 3 lobbyists for every member of the House and Senate. It is long overdue that we act in the interest of the American people, not corporations and not lobbyists. That is why I'm so proud to stand here today. And let me just say that with our new majority in the House, and we have representatives of our freshman class, you can be sure that our majority in the House is sending a message to pharma. It is sending a message to the President of the United States. We are going to take action. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. My fellow Vermonter, Peter Welch.
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, my colleagues. You know, there's a question. How is it in the United States we pay the most and have the least available when it comes to pharma prescriptions? And it's very simple. Government lets it happen. We are the only industrialized country where the representatives of the people and the leader of the country does not take action to protect consumers, to protect taxpayers, and to protect employers who are paying a lot for employer-sponsored health care. All of the things that pharma say are myths. You know, when we were talking, Elijah and I, to the president, Tom Price was there, and he was worried about price negotiation because he called it price fixing. We do have price fixing. It's called whatever pharma wants to charge, we have to pay. And they have these justifications about research. And as Ro Khanna said, what? This is all about Wall Street. How do you make the most money? Right now, they are getting the benefit of no competition because there's no price negotiation. They're getting the benefit of the NIH that is doing an immense amount of publicly taxpayer-financed research. They're getting the benefit of the research and development tax credit the taxpayers pay for. And by the way, we just passed the Trump tax cut, $2.6 trillion added to the deficit, a lot of that in the pocket of pharma. And did they do any R&D? No, they did stock buybacks that fattened executive pay. It is the consumers on the losing end, the taxpayers on the losing end. And right now, as we're sitting here, there is a proposed merger between two giants, Bristol-Myers Squibb and Celgene, $74 billion. And you know what happens with every single one of these mergers? The consumer, the taxpayer, and the employer pay. Because what they do is they now have more market power with those drugs. And what they do is they say, the cost of this, don't bother the shareholders. We don't want to disturb them. We'll raise the price of our products. That's happened time over and over again. And the only reason it happens is because we let them get away with it. Those days are over. We've got a new majority. We've got a president who claims he wants to do something about it. I think he does. But he's got to step forward, and he has some willing partners right here on this stage to bring relief to the American consumer, the American taxpayer, and the American employer who's hanging on to that health care for their employees. Thank you.
Great job.
Congresswoman Omar from Minnesota.
Thank you, Senator. It's really great to be here, but saddened that we are talking about an issue really that I sometimes don't understand that we are having a conversation about here in the United States. I believe that healthcare is a basic human right. And all over the world, there are people in developing parts of the world who are dying because they don't have access to healthcare or they don't have access to medicine. My aunt was one of those people. She died of diabetic shock at the age of 21 because she didn't have access to medication. And so in Minnesota last year, when I heard about Alec, who was 26 years old, who died because he couldn't access insulin to save his life, it did not make any sense to me. It is okay. It is okay for our mind to accept that there are parts of the world where we have to fight to make sure that they have access to these things. But people in that part of the world are hoping to come to the United States because they think you have access to simple things like healthcare, housing, and food. So I am excited to be part of the new majority, to have partners in the Senate who have moral clarity and courage to help us fight to make sure that Americans have access to medication and health care. Americans pay the highest prices to access the drugs in the world, including 3 times the price of drugs in Great Britain alone. And instead of taking donations from pharmaceutical industry, we need to hold them accountable for taking advantage of the American people. Medications are too expensive, and we must act boldly to lower prices. So these 3 critical bills are going to make few changes. One of them will end the disastrous exclusivity agreement that pharmaceutical companies enjoy on a drug, preventing more affordable generic options from coming to the market. The other will allow for an importation of prescription drugs from Canada so that we don't have to pay exorbitant high prices for our drugs. And the last one will allow for will make it so that there is Medicaid has allowance to negotiate to lower the drug prices. But these are just first steps. I am committed to fighting for Medicare for all, single-payer healthcare system to guarantee quality healthcare for all Americans. It is unacceptable that there are millions of people here in this country who are unable to seek care because they live without or cannot afford insurance. As an immigrant, as someone who came here 23 years ago, I came for the promise of America where things are accessible and that there is an abundance of resources. Every single day, I'm in shock that there are folks here in this nation that have to make a decision on whether they can put food on the table or get their medication that they need to save their lives. That there are people making a decision whether they file for bankruptcy or seek treatment for some disease that is going to kill them. Here in America, no one should be forced to make such choices. And I know the president campaigned on this, and we're going to hold him accountable to that, and we expect the American people to hold him accountable. If there's anything we can partner on this that is critical to the American people, it is this. And we're ready for that partnership to act on behalf of Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Magoo's, Colorado.
Well, first, let me just say that's a tough lineup to follow, starting with my good friend and colleague, Congresswoman Omar. And as a freshman member, I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you to the folks here in the Congress who have been leading this charge for so long, starting with Senator Sanders. And it's an honor to be able to be here in the United States Congress and to join him in the fight. I don't know that I could say it any better than my distinguished colleagues here today, but there can be no dispute that today American consumers pay far more for drugs than it costs to manufacture them. You have heard very clearly that the government is giving exclusive monopoly to pharmaceuticals, and it has to stop. Prescription drug prices continue to rise, and the only ones winning out right now are the pharmaceutical companies. Just to give you some context, in Colorado, about 570,000 Coloradans did not fill a prescription last year because it cost too much. I could spend hours here today recounting stories from neighbors and constituents of mine in Boulder, Colorado, in Fort Collins, in Loveland, who go without care because they can't afford it. No one in America should go bankrupt because they cannot afford to pay for life-saving medicine. We must get the profit motive out of our healthcare system. We must put a check on the pharmaceutical companies' reckless price hikes. And that is why I'm so proud to co-sponsor this legislative package with Representative Rokana and Representative Cummings, Senator Sanders, and many other of my colleagues who are gathered here today. This package represents much needed legislation to ensure that all Americans can get prescription drugs at an affordable price. The prescription drug bills respond directly to monopoly abuses by brand name pharmaceutical companies, which Representative Khanna articulated so well. They do so by increasing competition in the market and ensuring that Americans living in the wealthiest country in the world do not pay more for prescription drugs than the median price in 5 major countries. Instead of listening to the demands of the pharmaceutical industry and their 1,400 lobbyists, as Congresswoman Sikowski recounted, it is time that Congress started listening to the American people, who overwhelmingly believe that the cost of medication is too expensive. We must lower the cost of prescription drugs. We must ensure that we enact policies that work for the American people, not for the pharmaceutical industry. Again, as a freshman member, I know Congressman Omar can recount this as well, that voters in this last November election, I think it's pretty clear, they demanded bold action from their elected officials. It's one of the reasons that we are in the majority in the House. It is past time that we make tangible progress to reduce the cost of healthcare and prescription drug prices, and these bills represent an important step in that process.
Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
For Senator Booker, you received some criticism in 2017 for voting against the importation amendment. So I wonder if you view this effort as kind of